belong, and up with my Father and the angels, to this place where I belong.
Welcome to this episode of the Catechetical Corner, handing on and defending the faith. As Catholic Christians, we have completed the penitential season of Lent with the celebration of Easter in the height of the liturgical year by recognizing the reality of Jesus Christ's victory over death and the gift of everlasting life He gave to each of us in the resurrection. Unfortunately, in today's society, that supernatural gift is often denied by many modern skeptics whose scientific worldview holds that supernatural events are impossible in the natural world. I spent 13 years teaching history to high school students before entering a theology classroom and eventually becoming the director of the Office of Catechetics. Often I would remind my students that there is a real danger in reading modern bias and cultural experience into an event from the past that we were learning about in class. It's a subconscious thing we do, so frequently it escapes our notice, the way taking our next breath usually does. Credible historians always draw evidence about an event in question from the standpoint of a contemporary audience in which the event took place. Belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the modern worldview is an act of faith. That is, faith understood as something similar to a childlike belief in a fairy tale. However, the truth is, the Catholic faith has never mandated belief in any article of dogma that doesn't provide evidence from human reason to support it. Rational faith is not only possible, it's probable for one who objectively examines facts about the events known from the resurrection. Evidence and proof are not exclusively the same thing. However, there is ample evidence providing a rational reason to believe in one's heart and mind that a bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ happened in human history. Let's take a look at some of that evidence, and let's rejoice knowing He's truly risen. All right, in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 13 through 16, he says, "If there is no resurrection of the dead, then neither has Christ been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then empty too is our preaching, empty too is your faith. For if the dead are not raised, neither has Christ been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain." Pretty strong words from one of the original apostles who followed Jesus Christ. The entire credibility of the deposit of faith Jesus Christ handed on to the apostles hinges on His resurrection. If it happened, it validates every claim He made about Himself and everything we teach and believe as Catholics. If it didn't, then as St. Paul says later in that same letter, then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are the most pitiable people of all. In other words, to believe that is pitiful. And we have bought into the biggest dupe in human history. 18th century Enlightenment thinker David Hume proposes that if someone believes a miracle happened, they're either lying about it or they've been lied to. In any given situation, if a miracle is more unbelievable than the most common outcome, then the most common outcome is actually what happened. And since dead people don't commonly come back to life, then a dead man coming back to life is impossible. I want to examine the historical facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ from both a non-biblical and biblical source to put Hume's theory to the test within context of each one of these facts. And I believe what can be illustrated would shock the long-deceased Enlightenment philosopher. It's called the minimal facts approach. It's been used by many scholars throughout history to defend the legitimacy of the resurrection. It meets a skeptic where they're at. Even though I believe the Bible is inspired and inerrant, as many other people do, you could cede the fact to them that we're going to take that out of the equation, and we're going to treat it as a historical document, a Greco-Roman biography about a person who lived in the first century named Jesus of Nazareth. Modern scholars like Dr. Brant Petrie have shown that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do reflect when put up into comparison of other first century biographies about Greco-Roman biographies about people at that time. They have the same literary genre, the same tense, and the same presentation. A very short introduction about the person when they were born, the main focus on what they did in their life, and how they died. Now, this is not in opposition to anything the Catholic Church teaches. In fact, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 643 states, given all these testimonies, Christ's resurrection cannot be interpreted as something outside the physical order. In other words, it happened within nature, in the natural world. And it is impossible not to acknowledge it as a historical fact. Some people will say, well, I'm a Christian, and I believe in Jesus' resurrection based solely on faith alone. And that's one way to come to believe in the resurrection. But I also believe you can come to that conclusion based on history itself, and that the resurrection is the best explanation for the historical facts we have about the man who lived in the first century in Judea, who was crucified by the Romans, named Jesus of Nazareth. One of them comes from a historian named Josephus. He was a Jew who betrayed the Jewish people and ended up writing something about them after the fall of the temple in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed it. In his famous work in his Antiquities, he gives us evidence that not only Jesus existed, but that he was crucified. I'm going to quote a piece of that right now. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had him condemned to death on the cross. Around the same time, another historian named Tacitus, he's a Roman historian, also verifies Jesus existed and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He writes in his writings, the Annals, "A valence to relieve Nero from the infamy of being believed to have ordered the conflagration, the fire of Rome. Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt and punished Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius Caesar." All four Gospels record the crucifixion and the death of Jesus. And although some have denied his death on the cross and claim he survived the crucifixion, the Journal of American Medical Association did a study on crucifixion, and its results show that it's much more likely that Jesus did die on the cross. I'm going to share some of those results with you now. Jesus of Nazareth underwent Jewish and Roman trials, was flogged, and was sentenced to death by crucifixion. The scourging produced deep stripe-like lacerations and appreciable blood loss, and it probably set the stage for hypovolemic shock, as evidenced by the fact that Jesus was too weakened to carry the crossbar to Golgotha. At the site of crucifixion, his wrists were nailed. After that, the pallium was lifted into the upright post. His feet were nailed to the stipes. The major pathophysiologic effect of crucifixion was an interference with normal respirations. Accordingly, death resulted primarily from hypovolemic shock and exhaustion, asphyxia. Jesus' death was ensured by the thrust of a soldier's spear into his side. Modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. So if we're applying Hume's theory in this specific case, and the outcome, right, is more unbelievable than the normal outcome, which one would be more true? That it's more probable he didn't die on the cross, or that he did? I think the outcome would be that he probably did die on the cross. Fact number 2, Jesus Christ was buried in a tomb. A lot of people have suggested that he was never buried, or he was buried in a mass grave with other people, which is why the tomb on Easter morning that supposedly housed his body was empty. But the fact of the matter is, it's more than likely true that he was buried. And this is you can see this from a Jewish historical custom. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 and 23, it was known that if a criminal was executed on a tree, by nightfall they should be taken down and buried. And you can see it quoted here. If a man is guilty of capital offense, you shall hang him on a tree. His corpse shall not remain overnight. You must bury him on the same day. Anyone who's hanged is the curse of God. All the Gospels indicate Jesus was buried, and so do many of St. Paul's letters, which are written in Koine Greek in the first century. So if you look at the Koine Greek word used within that context, it's hatafe, which means to be buried. Not just to throw somebody aside or leave them on the cross for their body to decompose and then eventually fade away, but actually buried in the ground. Let's talk about politics for just a second. Politically speaking, in 2016 there was an election in the United States. A lot of people weren't very happy with the outcome of it. And in some cities, in some places, there were riots. And if you were a political leader at that time, and there was an efficacy of the elected president that was located in that area, and it was inciting the riot and causing it to escalate instead of to de-escalate, common sense would tell you that you would order the efficacy to be taken down because it would quell the temper of the people who were, revolting, and it would calm the situation down. Well, at this particular time when Jesus Christ was crucified, it was the Feast of Passover. And all the Jews were coming into Jerusalem. So there were several riots. The Gospels mention the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and they also mention a group of people known as the Zealots. In fact, Barabbas, the guy who was released instead of Jesus at the Passover, was a zealot. He had led many military insurrections and riots and killed many Roman people. So it would have made less sense for Pontius Pilate to leave Jesus up on the cross because he had a sign over his head that said he was the King of the Jews. And since he's the King of the Jews, and that's an insightful thing to Jews, it was insulting to them, and they had brought up armed rebellion against the Romans before, it would make much more sense, like it would in modern times, instead of leave an efficacy of something up that's going to make somebody who's rioting more offensive, to take it down and make sure that he was buried and put somewhere in a tomb. And he was buried by people who hated him. In other words, yes, Joseph of Arimathea, we're all aware that he was a secret disciple of Jesus Christ, but he was also a member of the council that had him killed. So it would have been really, really distasteful in the first century in Jewish custom to have an enemy bury you. So since it's so distasteful and not really normal, you'd have to accept that that's probably actually what happened. And it's not implausible that a first century crucifixion victim in ancient Rome would have been buried. We have an artifact in a Jewish museum in Israel. It's a first century artifact of an actual crucifixion victim. And you can see here the nail from the crucifixion still remained within the part of the cross which that person was crucified on and a portion of their heel bone. His name was Jehonanan, and it was found in an unmarked grave by archaeologists. So based on all this information, let's employ Hume's theory again. Is it more likely that Jesus wasn't buried or that he was? I would say that it's more likely that he was buried. Fact number 3. On Easter Sunday morning, Jesus Christ's tomb was empty. Is that history or is it legend? Well, I'm going to share an acronym with you that I think explains how we can know that's history and not legend. It's called JETS. Stands for Jerusalem, Enemy Attestation, the Testimony of Women, and Simple. So let's start with Jerusalem first. If you were going to try to convince somebody that you had a spaceship in your backyard, would it be easier for you to do that far away from your house in another country or in your hometown where you live? I would say it'd be a lot easier if you went to somewhere like, let's say, Australia, right? And you told somebody in Australia, hey, I've got a spaceship in my backyard. Well, they may or may not believe you, but it'd be easier to believe you because they really can't go and verify it, right? But if you were back here in Lafayette and that person was with you and for whatever reason they didn't like you and they wanted to make you look kind of, not really credible in front of other people, and they were within 10 minutes of your house and you said to them, hey, I have a spaceship in my backyard, they would just say, okay, hey, tell you what, let's go to your house. Let me see it in your backyard and let's show everybody that you have that spaceship. Well, guess what? The apostles didn't go out and first preached Christ's resurrection and Christ crucified in a foreign place. They began to preach it right where it happened, in Jerusalem. And if they were in Jerusalem and Christ's enemies, as we see in the Gospels, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, not only knew where his tomb was, but had put people there to prevent his body from being taken and then spread a rumor about his body being taken because they couldn't explain why his body wasn't there, they could have ended the apostles' spree in Jerusalem of saying, We've seen Jesus with a bodily resurrection. They could have gone to the tomb, taken out his dead body, and drug it through the streets of Jerusalem in front of all the witnesses and said, here's his body. He's dead. They didn't do that. E, enemy attestation. I'm going to quote you something from Matthew's gospel. Matthew 27. The next day, the one following the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that this impostor, while he was still alive, said, after 3 days I'll be raised up again. Give orders then that the grave had been secured until the third day, lest his disciples come and steal him and say to the people, he has been raised from the dead. This last impostor will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, the guard is yours. Go secure it as best you can. So they went and secured the tomb by fixing a seal to the stone and setting the guard. And in the next chapter, Matthew 28, while they were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had happened. They assembled with the elders and took counsel. Then they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him while we were asleep. And if this gets to the ears of the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. See, in first century Rome, if you were a centurion and you were on guard watch for the entire unit and you fell asleep and something happened to the unit, the penalty was death. So falling asleep while guarding the tomb, when you've been asked to do that by the emperor, renders this a sentence of death. So to keep those soldiers out of trouble, they were paid and then they lied about it. And why were they lying about it? Because there wasn't a body to be produced to disprove the fact that the tomb was empty. And this story is circulated among the Jews to this present day. And we still see that today. Many Jews deny the validity of Christ as the Messiah and his resurrection. The testimony of women, T. We see in the writings of some second century church fathers and some Roman historians who are challenging the faith that the credibility of a woman's testimony, it didn't have any credibility in the first century in ancient Jerusalem. So if you were going to make up a story about the resurrection and you were going to record it and share it with other people, you want a credible eyewitness. And the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection were women. So if you were going to make up the story, it would have been better to have Peter, John, and one of the original apostles be at the tomb on Sunday morning instead of the women. So since the women are included, instead of that, that's probably what happened. Now, I'm going to cite a quote here. As early as the 2nd century, critics of the church were using this detail to attack the credibility of the resurrection account. In a dispute with Origen, a church father, Roman philosopher Celsus says, when dead he rose again and showed the marks of his punishment, how his hands were pierced with nails. Who beheld this? A half-frantic woman, as you state? In other words, you're claiming something that's unbelievable and you're doing it on the testimony of somebody whose testimony has zero credibility. How am I supposed to take you seriously? Now, I used to use an analogy when I taught school. I would say, listen, if there was a model student in school or somebody who was really always doing something right, and there was somebody in school who always got in trouble, and they had a rap sheet as long as the parking lot, and the two of you were caught in an inconvenient situation, and the person who was the model student had something at stake. So you both agreed in that moment, because you were in good company, the best thing to do would be to fabricate a story. Who would you go and give that witness to of that fabricated story? Would you want the person who's the model student to do it to the administration and the parents? Or would you want the person who has a rap sheet as long as the parking lot? Well, common sense would tell you you want the model student to do it, because if the model student does it, they're going to buy it, right? If the person with a rap sheet as long as the parking lot does it, nobody's going to believe it. Well, having Mary Magdalene and those women be the ones who profess first to have seen the tomb empty and be eyewitnesses would have been the equivalent of having somebody have the person with a rap sheet as long as the parking lot be the one to testify to that. So it makes more sense that because that's the way they stated it, that's what actually happened. So once again, using David Hume's theory, right? Which one's more probable? That the tomb was empty or it wasn't? S, it's simple, right? All of the gospel accounts simply say Jesus Christ died on the cross on Good Friday. He was buried, and on Sunday morning when they went to find his body, the rock was moving out, the rock that sealed the tomb was moved, and his tomb was unexplainably empty. If you wanted something that was if you wanted something that was like exaggerated, you could read one of the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Peter, which gives a really crazy account where all the people who had crucified Jesus were there on Sunday morning, right? And then all of a sudden, 2 angels came down from heaven, opened up the tomb. He walked out. He was like enormous. And behind him, a cross came out and said, "Have you gone and preached the word to the people?" That's exaggerated. This is not exaggerated. It's simple. Okay, fact number 4. Jesus Christ appeared alive again after he was dead. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 8, Paul uses an ancient creed. When he wrote this letter around 56 AD, it was about 20-something years after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But this particular thing he lists here in chapter 15 is an ancient creed that actually dates back between about 3 to 4 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Notice the language he uses. Paul did not come up with this. For what I hand on to you, I first received, past tense. And you can see here when you read it, for I hand on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, that's the Greek name for Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, as to one born abnormally, he appeared to me. So a lot of people say with this hallucination hypothesis that it's possible that these 500 people at one time all hallucinated at the same time and all saw the same thing. Well, let's just put that to the test and see if that's actually medically possible. Now, I would submit to anybody sitting in here that it's possible for 500 people to hallucinate at the same time. But I don't think it's possible that they would all hallucinate the exact same thing. One of the examples I used to kind of bring this home is the idea that, when I went to Lafayette High, I was a member of a very large class, almost 500 people. But if I'd have left Lafayette High my sophomore year and moved to another state because my dad got transferred, and I stayed friends with all the people who were in my class, right? And then I came back my senior year and we graduated, and I missed an event, right? Between the time I left and the time I got back. And nobody told me about it till we got to like our 20-year high school reunion. And at our 20-year high school reunion, unfortunately, some of the people that were part of my class, as it says in Paul's account, had fallen asleep. They died prematurely. But everybody else that was there and witnessed it was still there. And they all made the same claim. Hey, when you went and moved out of town, Chad, this is what happened. And you know what? There was almost 500 of us there that witnessed it. Would I have any reason, 20 years after the fact, to doubt that testimony? No, I wouldn't. And the same is true here. 500 people, right? 20 years after Jesus' death, supposedly within 4 to 5 years after his death, and some that had died and some that were still living, were witnessing to the fact that 20 years earlier they had witnessed him alive. I don't think that's a reason to doubt that he wasn't there or that they were actually hallucinating. I think they actually experienced a resurrected person who had died and come back to life. And in the gospel accounts, it's not like the apostles didn't know what ghosts were. In the end of Luke's gospel, when Jesus appears to the apostles after his encounter with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, it even says they thought he was a ghost. But then notice he sat down and he had a meal with them. And what's interesting is that a resurrected person, if they're not in a bodily resurrection, is a spiritual apparition. And spiritual apparitions are immaterial. And we live in a material world. They're incapable, right, of being touched. They're incapable of being felt. They're incapable of consuming food. Immaterial things in their very nature do not need material substance or sustenance. Yet the apostles claim to have eaten and drunk with Christ post-resurrection. In fact, Peter does that in Acts of the Apostles when he's given a witness to this. And up here, I've taken a quote from that particular book in the Bible. We are witnesses of all that he did, both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. This man God raised on the third day and granted that he be visible, not to all the people, but to us, the witnesses chosen by God in advance, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. You don't eat and drink with the Spirit. We're confined as material beings within time and space to a time and space by the material nature of our body. That means the God that they encountered was a material being just like you and me. Okay, the origins of Christianity. I think this might be the most powerful argument for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. How it emerged as a messianic Jewish movement in the first century. Biblical scholar and writer N.T. Wright wrote a book, it's about 800 pages, called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And if I can take one of his historical arguments and kind of like make it as simple as possible. When the Jews were expecting the coming of the Messiah from a historical standpoint in the first century, they expected the Messiah to do 4 things: to reunite the 12 tribes of Israel, to cleanse the temple, to conquer the enemies of Israel, and then to reign as king from heaven and earth. Well, if you look at Jesus Christ, he fulfills all 4 of those things, but the one I really want to focus on is destroy the enemies of Israel. There was no sure sign to a first century Jew that somebody wasn't the Mashiach of Israel, the anointed one, than him being killed at the hands of the Romans. In fact, you can even see in Luke's gospel on the account of the road to Emmaus, as the 2 disciples are walking with Jesus, they say, well, listen, we thought he was the Messiah. Pun intended means obviously he was not, because he was killed by the Romans, right? Yet after he reveals himself to the apostles and after Pentecost, right, these 12 Jews are going out and they're proclaiming a bodily resurrection of a man who is the Messiah of Israel. And in ancient Israel, nobody believed in a bodily resurrection till the end of time, when the world came to an end. The world had not ended on Good Friday, yet Jesus Christ supposedly had a bodily resurrection on Easter Sunday, and they were going out proclaiming that. N.T. Wright says, and I agree with him, the most logical explanation for the reason why Christianity became a messianic movement. And when Paul writes, right, he says, Jesus Christos, right? In Greek, that's Jesus, the anointed one. Yeshua Mashiach in Hebrew, right? Jesus, the Messiah, was that it was a messianic movement. And the reason it was a messianic movement was because the best explanation for that is that he actually rose from the dead. A bodily resurrection. These are men that locked themselves up in a room for days after Jesus was dead, in fear that the people who persecuted Jesus and put him to death would put them to death. And then 50 days later, right, at Pentecost, after receiving the power of the Holy Spirit, they went out boldly in the face of those very people and proclaimed Christ crucified and resurrected. And they were fearless in the face of death. And why were they fearless in the face of death? Because they knew death wasn't the end, that there was something more. And the best explanation for that, in real life, historical method, is a post-death bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if we employ Hume's theory one last time, which is more likely, based on all the evidence? Jesus Christ rose from the dead, or he didn't? I think the evidence clearly illustrates no person could take the opportunity to ignore or avoid answering that question. 1 Peter 3:15-16 states, always be ready to give an explanation to those who ask you for the reason for the hope that is within you, and do so in gentleness and reverence, so that those who malign you for being in union with God will be put to shame. People that never existed, they don't have relatives. As we see St. Paul state about Jesus in his letter to the Galatians, then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to confer with Cephas, but I did not see any other of the apostles, only James, the brother of the Lord. St. Paul himself did not know Jesus Christ personally in his public ministry or before his public crucifixion. There is no other explanation for Paul's radical change of heart as a new covenant Jew who came to realize Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah of Israel, outside the reality of Jesus' bodily resurrection. Arguments don't bring people to faith, but they can keep someone away from it. Historical data holds as much weight as scientific evidence in shaping modern understanding of the past. When shared in love, those facts can be a bridge for the person desiring to swim in an ocean, but has never been close enough to it to decide whether they want to dive in or not. God love you, and happy Easter.